Good evening and welcome to Tipperary Studies for our December lecture from the Tipperary People and Places series. Our theme tonight is the Butlers of Kilcash, and who better than John Flood. John, who lectures in English literature in the Netherlands, is a native of Kilcash and so is most familiar with the area. John is the recent author of the book Kilcash and the Butlers of Ormonde, Conflict and Kinship from the Middle Ages to the Great Famine. So a warm welcome to John.
Several years ago, I was at a conference which was mainly populated by medieval philosophers, and this was in Lincoln in England. I was introduced to one of the participants, and he asked me where I was from, and I said Ireland. He was clearly an American, and as we chatted, he said, "Where from in Ireland?" And I gave my usual answer, which is Kilcash. "Cad bit fasta gan Aimed?" he inquired. "Tá jure na gailt Earl," I replied, and many of the people who were around us, who amongst them spoke God knows how many languages, were very puzzled to know what was going on. What was happening was something that's happened to me in one form or another in various parts of the world, which is that you bump into somebody who has heard of the famous song Kilcash. And even if they don't have a lot of Irish, they can normally recite or perhaps even sing several verses of it. And this usually makes quite an impression on anybody around you who sees that you've just met one another for the very first time. Usually people are extremely impressed. There is a good reason to be impressed by Kilcash, and I want to explore some of that today when I look at some of the history that's behind the song. Who was the famous Javan Lady Ive? What was her life like? What was her family circumstances like? And was she really somebody who was worthy of being celebrated as an important heroine? The principal burial place of the Butlers of Ormonde is in St. Canice's Cathedral in Kilkenny. The magnificent tomb that we see at the front of this photograph is that of John Butler, the second Marquess of Ormonde, who was drowned in 1854. Plaques on the wall record the deaths of Pierce Butler, the 8th Earl, in 1539, and his successor James, who was poisoned in London. So he's buried in London, but his heart was sent back here to St. Canice's. We also see Walter Butler of Kilcash, the 11th Earl, buried here in 1633. Moving from Kilkenny to South Tipperary, if you go to Kilcash, this is the view that you see from the road today, of course depending on what time of year it is. In the foreground there is a medieval church. At the back we see the Tower of Kilcash Castle, and in between there is the 18th century Butler Mausoleum. The 18th century mausoleum is a bit clearer in this aerial photo. It's to the right of the church. There are some large rocks in the middle of its floor, and these, which I've circled in yellow, were cemented in place by the County Council in the 1990s to prevent people from descending into the underground space which held the bones of the main subjects of this talk: Thomas Butler of Kilcash, his wife Lady Ive, his brother Archbishop Christopher Butler, and his son John, who succeeded to the Ormond inheritance. This building is also the place where the 16th and 17th Earls of Ormond are buried. The Kilcash Mausoleum cedes first place to St. Canice's as a Butler burial site, but I would say that it comes a very close second. Thomas Butler's grandfather, Richard of Kilcash, was the brother of the first Duke of Ormonde, and he played a very prominent role in the wars, the Confederate Wars of the mid-17th century. Richard lived to be an old man. He was in his mid to late 80s, and in fact he survived his own eldest son, Walter. So Thomas, his grandson, inherited Kilcash, a property that had been in Butler hands since the mid-1500s. Richard and Walter Butler had been army officers in the 17th century, and they had both held the rank of colonel. Richard had seen the loss of his estate with the advent of the Cromwellian army at the end of a series of complex wars which saw him allied to political, religious and family causes. He was a professional soldier, but this arose from his social status rather than from any economic necessity. The first historical record we have of Richard's grandson, Thomas, is at the siege of Buda, half of modern Budapest, in 1686. Here in Buda, a Christian alliance against the expansion of the Ottoman Empire put aside its internal squabbles for a while. This is where Butler cut his teeth, but the most military experience he had was at home in Ireland after the great European powers, including Britain, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, the Papacy and France, had become enmeshed in the 9 Years' War. In Ireland, this tumult manifested itself as the Williamite Wars, or the War of the Two Kings, the kings being James II and William III. The Catholic James II was backed by Louis XIV's increasingly powerful France, while the Protestant William of Orange was allied to the interest of the Pope. Butler fought on the side of King James, alongside many who were connected to his family, or who would become connected to it subsequently. Crucially, his most important relative, James, the second Duke of Ormonde, fought for King William, and this is something that I'll return to. Butler was in command of a regiment which had about 400 men at its height. When equipped, they bore muskets or pikes, but it wasn't uncommon for them to have neither of these. The colonel was in charge of paying his men, and one observer alleged that Butler was claiming to have more soldiers than he actually had, so as to skim money from wages. We've some idea of Butler's regiment's manoeuvres. Unfortunately, there are not enough to, for example, put up a slide here with a map with arrows tracing these throughout the war. We know, for example, that he fought at the Battle of Aughrim in July 1691. Aughrim of the Slaughters, as it was called, was a catastrophic loss for the Jacobites. In a footnote of history, we learn that Thomas Butler's horse was shot from under him and that he and his brother John were taken prisoner. Eventually, the Jacobites were allowed to retreat to Galway and Limerick. There's some military skullduggery, which is perhaps better documented and more interesting than troop movements. Part of King William's force were Danish mercenaries commanded by the Duke of Württemberg, an officer whom Butler had met while the two of them were fighting against the Ottomans. In January 1691, Württemberg, who controlled Tipperary, wrote from Clonmel to Thomas Butler to let him know that he was looking after Butler's grandfather, Richard, and to reassure him of King William's good intentions towards his Irish opponents. The king would guarantee Catholics freedom of your religion and the security of your estates, together with the continuance of the rank or employment of those who would like to carry on a military career. Württemberg also had a personal inducement for Butler. For yourself in particular, I shall do my best to have you given the rank of brigadier. This correspondence was a trap. Württemberg, at around the same time, wrote to an ally saying, "Intrigues with the Irish are being pushed forward, promising them great things if they come to terms, and this has caused such mistrust among them that 7 of their colonels have been placed under arrest." Butler replied to Württemberg thanking him for his solicitude. Unfortunately, he felt he could not cooperate, as even though everyone here is agreed about the good intentions of King William, we are quite unable to endure the yoke of the English, who, after his death, will not fail to break their word, so hostile are they to this nation. Butler's loyalties were not to be bought, neither for promotion nor for concern for his grandfather, who was in Württemberg's protection, and I think protection here must be understood to be in inverted commas. He ends with a message for the king. "I thank your highness 1,000 times for your offers. We pray and desire your highness's health." This might seem slightly odd to us, given that Butler had a regiment fighting against the king, but the respect due to monarchs was often borne in mind by early modern rebels. After the Treaty of Limerick, Butler retired to Kilcash. The provisions of the treaty allowed landed commanders to do this. Butler was further helped by the fact that the second Duke of Ormonde had fought alongside William III, and that the Duke retained control of the Butler Palatinate of Tipperary, which was a personal Ormond jurisdiction established in the Middle Ages. One privilege which Thomas Butler retained, which might seem a little risky from the government's point of view, was the right to bear arms. Butler had a deer park at Kilcash, and he rented another one at Carrick-on-Suir. The loss in terms of class prestige and personal enjoyment that being weaponless would have been to him would have been considerable. Because of fear of invasion and political unrest, he had to surrender these arms on various occasions in the 18th century, though. James II may have fled Ireland, but the Stuarts remained a threat to Britain, who was constantly at war in this period. In 1708, things were so bad that Butler was detained in Dublin Castle. Perhaps more dangerous still was the fact that the second Duke was denounced as a Jacobite, and he fled to the continent. As a traitor, he lost his Ormond title, but his brother Charles, who had also fought on the side of William III and who had been made Earl of Arran, was able to purchase the family lands. And this turned out to have an enormous significance for Kilcash, and it's something that I'm going to return to later. So this is a wonderful satirical print by William Hogarth from 1721, and it shows a world that's gone crazy with speculation on shares, which the artist represents as the equivalent on getting on a fairground ride. One of the small number of Catholic Irish investors who got his fingers burnt in the South Sea bubble was Thomas Butler. The bubble didn't discriminate on the grounds of religious belief, as you can see from the figures in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. Any sympathy we might have today for Butler may be mitigated by the fact that the South Sea Company was involved in shipping slaves from Africa to South America, and in fact it had a monopoly on that trade. So I'm going to leave Thomas Butler here in this rather ambiguous state and turn now to his wife, Lady Iveagh. Because of the song, Lady Iveagh enjoys more popular brand recognition than her husband, or indeed than many of her extremely exalted Ormond relatives. Margaret Burke was the daughter of William, the 7th Earl of Clanrickard, one of the most prominent noblemen in the country, a man who was on the Privy Council of 2 monarchs and who was Chief Governor of County Galway. The Earl was a widower, and Lady Iveagh was a child of his second family. Lady Iveagh's mother was Helen McCarthy, daughter of the Earl of Clancarty. Lady Helen was a niece of Richard Butler of Kilcash, and she was a widow when she married Lady Iveagh's father. Helen brought an enormous amount of money with her to the marriage, and the question of who was to inherit some of this occupied a good deal of Lady Iveagh's later life. Lady Iveagh had other important relatives. Her sister Honora married Patrick Sarsfield, and, on becoming a widow, she wed James Fitzjames Stuart, the Duke of Berwick, and one of the illegitimate sons of King James II. When Lady Iveagh was aged 16, she married Brian McGuinness, 5th Viscount Iveagh, and a Jacobite commander who was the governor of Drogheda during the Battle of the Boyne. For this he was declared a rebel, and his title was extinguished. After the Treaty of Limerick, he became one of the wild geese, choosing to go into service for Catholic Austria. He died fighting for the Austrians against the Ottomans in about 1693. Unfortunately, it's hard to be more precise than that. The couple had a daughter who died at a young age, and again, we don't know any more than this. Lady Iveagh wed Thomas Butler in 1696. Because her second husband had no title, she, who would otherwise have become Margaret Butler, kept the courtesy title of Viscountess Iveagh. That there's a slide with a priest's name on it, and that this priest is the author of an Irish catechism besides this, is not very surprising for anyone who knows anything about Lady Iveagh, because in her own time and since she has been greatly renowned for her piety. There's abundant evidence that this was a well-deserved reputation, but I want to talk about some other aspects of her here, because her piety is only one side of a complex story. What is the connection between Father Andrew Dunleavy and Lady Iveagh? He was the rector of the Irish College in Paris at a time when all Catholic education for the priesthood had to be carried on abroad. And there is a letter which is held in the Parliamentary Archives in London, which was addressed from Andrew Dunleavy to Lady Iveagh in the 18th century, thanking her for looking after his family. The letter was intercepted by the government because Lady Iveagh was on a government watch list, And the interceptors were right in believing that the letter was something other than an act of private charity. So it wasn't simply the case that Lady Ive had sent some money to France for a poor Irish family. Instead, she was propping up part of the Irish College. So that shows you that at this time when Lady Ive is renowned for her charity, that this charity sometimes has political as well as religious connotations. This wasn't an isolated thing for her. It's not that she abounded so much in charity that she got out of her normal personality and she sent this money, for example, to Father Dunleavy. This was something that she was quite used to doing. It was a sphere in which she was comfortable because she had spent many years in the law courts contesting the distribution of her mother's will. And tracing all of this on a slide is very boring, so I'm going to compress it just to say that it went to the House of Lords and that it went on for over a decade. So Lady Ive, who is named in parliamentary bills as a result of this legal activity, is not somebody who never interacted with the public sphere. What we have, as well as historical records about her, are very interesting legends which are recorded in folklore. One of these has her at the Butler house in Garryricken, where she is feeding the pigeons in the winter. And from the account that survives, she's almost like a St. Francis figure. She's standing out in the snow and the birds are coming to her. And folklore records that one of the things she did for the birds was she made a special birdhouse for them to look after them. However, when you look at the description of the birdhouse, you realise that it is something that was common enough in the 18th century. It was a place for raising pigeons, not for racing, not for their own good, but rather for eating them. So this St. Francis figure, you see how she is a kind of overlay of legend over a much more mundane, straightforward and culinary reality. Another perhaps sharper legend is one where her son is going out to convert to Protestantism and she prays that something will prevent this, and he's thrown from his horse and killed, and she's happy about this. Well, that is rather, or would have been a rather appalling thing if it had happened, but instead it's the conflation of two historical facts. She had a young son, too young to convert to anything, who was killed in a riding accident, and her surviving son did convert to Protestantism, but we'll see that this had nothing to do with the prayers or the lack of prayers of Lady Ive. The Butlers had three sons. Richard died in a riding accident, Walter died of smallpox while studying in Paris, and that left John. Now let me remind you of an earlier part of this talk. The second Duke of Ormonde has fled Britain and been declared a traitor. His younger brother, the Earl of Arran, acquires the Ormond lands. As Arran is an Earl, he doesn't need to rock the boat by adopting the earldoms of Ormond, or Ossory for that matter. Arran is childless, and his next male relative is John Butler of Kilcash. Arran doesn't die suddenly, so the Kilcash family has until 1758 to manoeuvre around the facts of the succession. John Butler converts to the Church of Ireland so that religion is not a bar to his inheritance. Lady Ive and Thomas Butler are closely involved with this. Religion is not to get in the way of a family fortune. If the Earldom of Ormond had still been active, John would have become the 15th Earl of Ormond. 2 steps in succession later, the title is revived and a Butler becomes the 17th Earl. The places for the 15th and 16th Earls are kept by so-called de jure Earls, men who would have had the title of right. John Butler then inherits a great deal of property and an enormous amount of respect, but he remains plain Mr. Butler. Plain Mr. John Butler did not aim to live a plain life. There were 10 and 12-day parties for his family and friends at Kilcash, and return visits equally as long. Hunting passed a good deal of time. Somewhat more exotically were long stays spent in London in the Grosvenor Square area, for example at Bruton Street, which you see on the map. His mother pleaded in vain for him to return and address his family duties, but he preferred the high life of the capital. 3 years before he died, Butler married in London. He wed a Bridget Stacey from Berkshire. Well, who was she? If one of his sisters married a viscount and another one into the family of the kings of Leinster, Bridget Stacey might be assumed to have been very well connected. Instead, it seems that she was merely some way related to the Earl and Countess of Powys. The couple did not get on well together, and by this I mean Butler and Stacey, not the Earl and Countess of Powys, and they were eventually legally separated. And the most likely explanation of the marriage and its brief duration was Butler's mental illness. This, along with a reputation for dissipated living, made it difficult for Butler in the marriage market. His wife ended up with more than she bargained for, and although her Powys relatives thought that she was negligent towards her husband, we must understand that her domestic circumstances could have been extremely difficult. John died in the care of his Garry-Ricken relatives in 1766. He had no male heirs, so his Garry-Ricken cousin became the de jure 16th Earl. Two of the Butler sons died while they were young. 4 daughters were married into distinguished families, which were part of an ongoing networking strategy. The accident of naming conventions means that sons of Kilcash would have remained Butlers, while daughters took their husbands' surnames. This obscures the closeness of the daughters' connections to their home. That this closeness exists is clear from various letters about personal affairs or business, and from long visits paid to one another's homes. The Kilcash daughters sometimes wed into families which were already connected to them. One good example is the marriage of Margaret to George Mathew of Thurles. The Mathews were descended from the second marriage of Lady Thurles, a daughter-in-law of Earl Walter of Kilcash. The children of the Kilcash daughters went on to become important nobility, soldiers and nuns. Each of them could easily give rise to a talk of its own, and in what follows I'm only going to briefly touch on the places where some of them lived, as I want to use the images to tie into a description of Kilcash. So I'm cannibalizing history somewhat here. Honora Butler married Valentine Browne, 3rd Viscount Kenmare, an occasion which is marked by 2 poems from Aegon O'Rahala. Some of the Brownes believed that the match was below him, but he had the luxury of being able to do what he wished, and he spent a lot of time at Kilcash. This slightly grainy picture in the slide is of Killarney House, which was erected in the 18th century. The building no longer exists as the Brownes replaced it. Focusing on the main part of the house, it can be seen that there are 7 bays or 7 windows in the centre and 3 bays on either end, so it's a 13-bay building. And this was built at the time that Honora Butler marries Valentine Browne. In 1724, Mary Butler married Brian Kavanagh of Borris. The Kavanaghs are an ancient Gaelic family whose seat in Borris is still open to the public, and you can go and visit it today. Its medieval part was remodelled in the early 18th century, so what you're looking at here has many elements which date back to the Butler-Kavanagh marriage. And I'm including a family tree here if you want to try and put all of these people into a mental space. I'm not going to talk about it, but you can pause the video if you want to find and see if there's any information that you've missed out on. In this, the last section of my talk, I'm going to describe Kilcash Castle as it would have been in the 18th century. Gadhiedimid fasta ganaimid. Well, you can just about see Kilcash Castle in the centre of this photo, and one of the reasons is that almost all of the deciduous woodland around it is cleared. Just off the screen, Cill leases ground in which they've planted evergreens and in which people can have bracing walks. In the time of Lady Ive, walking was more decorous, as the woods were landscaped and included a water cascade, along with the simultaneously utilitarian and decorative fish pond. The layout of these woods can be seen on 19th century Irish Ordnance Survey maps, and these can be found in the Heritage Viewer on the Archaeological Survey of Ireland site, whose address is given at the end of this presentation. I can't show it here for copyright reasons, but browsing the survey's maps of Kilcash is well worth the effort. Lady Ive was long dead before the trees were sold at the turn of the 19th century to pay some of the creditors of the then Marquess of Ormonde. This dates the writing of the song to years after the death of Father John Lane, who is often named as being its author. The real identity of the author is more mundane. It was written by a Kilcash pig dealer who did not live long enough to ensure that he garnered the praise for it, as, following the death of his wife and the failure of his business, he killed himself. That, however, is a 19th century story, and for another time. Looking west from Kilcash Castle is the straight run of the road that the song calls the Avenue. It is much narrowed now from its original 60 metres width, and it ran between the castle and what was then the main road over Slievenamon between Kilkenny and Clonmel. It's not my purpose here to go into the archaeology of the whole Kilcash site, and instead I want to point out some features that will give an idea of what the castle and its environs were like in the 18th century. In the middle of the photo is a 16th century tower, a building which was transformed from a battlemented one, which was a place of defence, to one part of a luxurious house. To the right of the tower, which is south, a field occupies what was once a lawn, and there you can just about see the adjoining walled gardens, which will be clearer on a later slide. Not that long ago, if you stood on the lawn in front of the castle and looked up to the north to see it, you couldn't have missed the extensive scaffolding. The OPW carried out vital conservation work on the edifice. Previously, it had been in such bad repair that it was in danger of falling down. The OPW have saved it for the nation by repairing the walls and lowering a giant metal brace into the interior of the castle. After John Butler's death, Kilcash was no longer the main Butler residence. The family moved to Kilkenny and then to London. The castle remained substantially intact until the mid-19th century. In this photo, taken from the north, the top of the metal brace that I just mentioned is marked in yellow, and it can be seen peeking out of the tower. On the north wall, the windows circled in dark blue have had their surrounds replaced. You can see that these surrounds look newer, because it's OPW policy to ensure that any conservation work they do can be recognised as such, and not mistaken for an original element of the building. North of the tower is a ruined wall. This was once a kitchen wing of the castle, and facing it across the yard was another wing which has entirely disappeared. In the 18th century, north of the castle then, there was a yard surrounded on three sides by buildings and closed off by a wall which isn't shown here, but which was in one of the previous slides. And this wall was called the Bawn and dated back to the construction of the tower, and it's where the current entrance to the site is. Note that although all the scaffolding is gone, the site of the castle is still closed off and the door into the tower is locked, as there's still work to do. Visitors can explore the church, the graveyard and the mausoleum, but they can only see the castle from outside. This isn't a very aesthetic photo, but it's a useful one for me here. To the right of the tower are the remainder of three bays of a house, which date from the 17th century, but with later modifications. The wall is 12.5 metres, roughly 12.5 yards long. The slide with the scaffolding shows how tall this house was. There was a ground floor, a first floor and a floor in the roof. Along with the tower, it would have been a fine home, and that the song lamented Kilcash might be explained more on account of its people rather than the extraordinary size of the building. This is the Kilcash that passers-by on the Clonmel-Kilkenny road see today. However, the surviving house is only part of a building that extended for 10 bays, about 47 metres. This is marked in yellow. On the gable end of this was another building marked in blue, which was probably a private chapel, and recall that the local church was owned by the Church of Ireland in the 18th century and thus not available for the worship of the people and the castle. If you think of Valentine Browne's house of 13 bays, then you can see that the butler's daughter did not move from Tipperary rusticity into Kerry luxury. This photo is taken from the top of the castle, looking east. In the yellow circle we see a bakehouse, which is the only surviving building in a landscape that included a domain farm. Lady Ivey signed a lease for a mill, the stream for which runs behind the bakehouse and along behind the walled gardens, which are indicated by the blue arrow, and I'm going to look at them in my next picture. East of the castle are 4 walled gardens, which were used for growing fruit and vegetables. They're near the castle and not relegated to a distant part of a farm, as such gardens showed the moral state of the owners, whose flourishing land reflected their worth. If we look up at the southeast of the castle, we see that the walls of the garden are about 2.4 metres high. The north and west sides are lined with brick to retain the heat required for various fruits, and fruit grew there until the 19th century. Between the walled gardens are stone-faced arches. Even now, as you see them in their decayed state, they give some idea of the luxury of Kilcash in its heyday. The castle and its grounds were at the heart of a vast estate, including most of the surrounding townslands, as well as property in North Tipperary and Kilkenny. It's not surprising then that its ruin was remarked on in song. As is more often than not the case, more has to be omitted than included. And a noteworthy absence is the bishop mentioned in Kilcash, Thomas Butler's brother, Christopher, who was the Archbishop of Cashel and who was based in Kilcash, where he had some shelter from priest hunters, rather than, for example, at Thurles. In addition to refuge from sporadic enforcements of penal laws against the episcopate, Christopher's home afforded him the luxury to which he was accustomed. He had, after all, been educated with gentlemen in London, and he'd studied theology at Paris. Back in Ireland, his brother and sister-in-law shared the same patrician piety that combined fortitude with entitlement. The bell has been silenced, their mausoleum destroyed, and their bones disturbed by animals, but they have yet to be eradicated from the popular memory, from history, or from the landscape. Thank you very much for having the patience to bear with this unusual lecture about Kilcash, unusual for me at least, in that instead of delivering it to a live audience, I'm sitting in my house in the Netherlands talking to a screen. I hope that you'll forgive any of the technical glitches. Bye.